Dr. Lester Sumrall ministers daily by television to millions of people around the world. For the next hour, you'll experience one of the most exciting programs that is proclaiming the truth of God's Word, love, and blessing. You are to experience the life story of Lester Sumrall, a man of faith and destiny. And now, Dr. Sumrall.
I'd like to welcome you to part 4 of a life of faith and a life of destiny. The day I started around the world and only had $12, I began to weep. I just faced 20 years of age, and I'd had 3 years in the ministry. It didn't seem like much, but here I was going into the vast unknown out of America, and I didn't know how long I'd be there, and I had one preacher to say I wouldn't get back, and he said I'd die in China, starve to death, and he was irritated at me for going off without any denominational background of supervision and so forth. I was an independent, and the call of God can make you independent. If Moses had waited for a committee to get him together, he'd have never delivered the children of Israel. And so sometimes God has to do a thing through a person. But anyway, I was dissolved inside when I thought of going around the world on my own and had so little money to do it on. And God spoke to me and said, read John chapter 15 and verse 16. It says, "Ye have not chosen me, but I have chosen you." And as I read that, I said, I'm sure glad to hear that. God has spoken to me through His Word in every crisis of my life. And every single crisis of my life, God speaks to me out of the abundance of His Word. Not through a little box of promises, or not just letting the Bible fall open, but by the Lord saying, this is your verse for this moment. And He said, you haven't chosen me, I have chosen you. And so I hadn't said, well, I'll be a missionary, or I'll be a world traveler. I hadn't said anything. God has said, I have chosen you. and you haven't chosen me. And then in the next line He says, and I have anointed you. Now the word anointed means to ordain. It means to set apart. It means to dedicate. And God said, I have set you apart. I have dedicated you. I am sending you forth. I have ordained you, to do this. And I said, well, I have been ordained by man in a denomination. Now I am to be ordained by God. And I said, but between the two ordinations, this one comes first. Ordained of God to do a certain job. No man can stop you when God ordains you to do a thing. And when God says, I'm doing it, and you're the instrument, you'll do it. No matter how big it is, how broad it is, you will do it. And He said, this is in the Gospel of John, chapter 15, verse 16. You have not chosen me, I have chosen you and ordained you that ye should go. And I said, whew, that's what I'm doing. I'm not sitting in a rocking chair. I'm on my way right now around the world. My suitcase is right here with me, and I'm in movement. God says, that's the way I like it. And that ye should go. Many times we'd like to have the great power of God demonstrated in our lives and sit in a rocking chair and rock back and forth and say, well, praise the Lord. No. The power of God is for action. The power of God is to send forth into the world, to change the world, to bless the world, to help the world. The power of God is not for selfish keeping within your own being. Never. And He said that you should go. And then He says, you shall bring forth fruit. That's in that verse. You shall bring forth fruit. There is nothing so self-satisfying to a minister of God than to have fruit. If he pastors a church, it grows. If he holds a revival meeting, it's big. There's nothing so fulfilling as fruit in your ministry. And when it's fruitless, well, you don't know what to do about it, really. You wonder if you're out of the will of God, if you're a failure or what you are. But God promised. He said, if I send you forth, you'll bear fruit. And I said, oh God, I'm sure glad for that. And all the nations that I go to, I'm going to bear fruit for the kingdom of God. That will mean precious souls will be saved. And then the next line says, and your fruit shall remain. Now that was a better one. it's one thing to bear fruit. It's another for it to remain. I know of a friend that had a great revival in a country. 100,000 people converted, and I went to that country later, and I said, I'd like to find the converts of that revival. And they said, well, we don't know where to find them. He said the evangelist left town the same day he finished the meeting. He had no organization for following it up, and says, I wouldn't know where you could find 12 of them all in one piece. I said, that's not fruit remaining. That is not fruit remaining. I want fruit that remains. And so when we went throughout the world, we found this. In Australia, we were there for only 3 months. We started a church in a tent meeting, a brand new church. We baptized the first converts. We set the church in order. Today it has 1,000 people. Not today, not a long time ago, right now, this moment, it has them. In England, we started 3 churches. They're there now, today, living and growing and being blessed of God. Today, you see. And in Alaska, we started 3 churches. And when we'd hold a crusade, we just didn't walk out of town. We said, I want something to live here after I'm gone, and memory of the labors that I perform. And they have 3 churches in Alaska today because of that. In the Philippines, they have many churches that I have founded and built myself. And in Hong Kong, we have 2 churches that I founded and built myself. And in the United States, a number of these also. And so what God promised, you see, is true. When God makes you a commitment, it is true. God will perform all He has said He would perform. And in my life, there's a living witness to when God says it, believe it. It will work, it will function, it will come to pass. You got to believe it. You got to believe it. And so, now this was said to me when I started around the world with no funds, with no guarantees, with no assistance that we knew of. He said, your fruit should remain, and that whatsoever you ask the Father in my name, He'll give it to you. And I said, well, no, there's no need of me asking. Says, I don't have anything. I need everything, so let's just start at the bottom and work up. And I have found God to be so great in that. Before we went to the Philippines, we took a small group in South Bend, Indiana, and the Lord told me, says, I need to train you here if you're going to go to one of these third world countries where one great capital city is greater, is the greatest thing in the country, really. It is the country almost. That one great city almost is the country. That you found a great deliverance center there and a great evangelistic outreach there. It will reach the whole nation. And then you won't have to send missionaries behind every banana tree. You send the nationals back home, converted in the capital city. And I said, hey, God, that's great. I said, that's like Paul did. Paul went to the great cities of the earth, and he established the kingdom there. And from there, the nationals took it out to the smaller towns and to the villages in order to evangelize a country. I said, it certainly seems good. But in South Bend, Indiana, where the Lord located me to train me, we took a little building there that seated about 165, and it was a despicable little old thing. And it still stands. I sold it for a print shop. The print shop is still in it. And it was built out of secondhand lumber and free labor. And whenever it rained, always leaked. You couldn't keep it from leaking no matter how much you worked on it. But the windows didn't open normally like windows do, up and down. They went in and out because there wasn't enough room for it. If you stood on near the wall, if you were 6 foot, your head was at the ceiling. And so I thought that was, I didn't want to preach in a place like that. And so I sold it. And we went into a tent for 11 weeks. Moved to church with Sunday school and all the Sunday school records in the church office and everything into a tent for 3 weeks, for 11 weeks. I preached the first 9 of them myself. And by the time the tent meeting was over, we'd sold our place, our church. So we moved into the 3rd-story dance hall. And we rented the dance hall on Sunday and certain nights of the week. And a lot of people were saying, say, we've lost a church here, But by the time the 11 weeks was over, we had 2 to 3 times as many as the church had when I went there, and the thing was 25 years old. And so we hadn't done bad for the first 3 months. But we built a church seating 1,000 people. And well, as soon as we got into it, Rex Humbard walked in the door and said, can I hold a meeting here? And I said, you sure can. And the thing was packed and jammed until the the policeman had to direct the traffic in the street. And then Clifton Erickson came, and then Oral Roberts came to the city. We sponsored his meeting as chairman of his meeting. And we had a colossal move of God, a tremendous move. We left behind 1,000 beautiful people in Sunday school, up to 2,000, 2,300, and like that. But in the building of that by faith, it was real interesting. We bought a beautiful lot right on the main street of the city, and we had a city block that we'd purchased. We paid all the money we had down on it. I think it's $10,000 that we had left over from the sale of the little building that we began in. And so we paid that down, and I said, we need $25,000 more to pay for it. And so I said, if I don't have that money for you, you can keep the 10, I'll be leaving town. Well, that was a kind of a desperate way to leave a little group, But it wasn't a week after that until a man called and said, you own that whole city block there on Michigan Street? I said, yes, sir. He said, sell me a little piece of it. I said, no, I couldn't do that. I'm going to build a church. He said, you don't need a whole block for a church. Sell me a little of it. And he said, you're just a dog in the manger. And I said, no, I'm not. Yes, he said, yes, you are. You don't need a city block for just a church. And he said, I'll have the same architect, and he will blend the buildings together, and it'll be beautiful. Well, I said, you wouldn't pay for the lot like what I want anyway. He said, yes, I would. He says, what do you want for it? I said, $30,000 in cash. Well, he said, that's a little too much. I said, last price, $29,000. And he said, all right, I'll take it. So I paid off the $25,000 that I owed the man that we bought it from. I had $4,000 to start it on. So I started a church. After that, we had to insure it for $500,000 by faith. By faith, I had well, again, I put up a tent. I was an evangelist, you see, and I'd take up an offering every night and put it in that tent. Put it in that building every day, pay my bills with the building, hoping I could stay up with it. Well, you might in the summertime, but wintertime would come, and you couldn't be out there in that tent, so you'd have to go back up into that dance hall again. And you don't have as many people on the third floor as you do on a tent on the main street. And so it was not easy. God began to do amazing miracles. One woman knocked on my door early one morning, and I went to the door and I said, yes, ma'am. And she says, I want you to know I don't like you. I don't like the way you preach. But and I said, thank you. And she said, but God told me to give you $1,000, and here it is. And she handed me a check for $1,000. And in that time, a number of years ago, that was a lot of money. It would buy almost much as $10,000 today. And so I said, I says, it doesn't matter whether you like my preaching or not. Thank you very much. I appreciate this. And so she was a school teacher on her way to teach that morning, gave me $1,000. There was an old man that lived across from the street from the tent ground where I was holding the meeting. He had a great big rambling house over there. And an old man, he sat on the front porch and rocked in his rocking chair, and he could hear the tent meeting, but he didn't come across and sit in it. One day he sent a messenger over and said, tell that preacher to come see me. So I went over and said, yes, sir, what can I do for you? He says, I want you to take me downtown. Well, I said, well, dear Lord, I'm having a tent meeting and I'm trying to build a church, and here I have to be a taxi and a chauffeur. And I said, well, yeah, he said, I want you to take me downtown. I don't have anybody else to do it. And I thought for a moment. I said, well, the Bible says to be a servant, and I'm getting to be one. And so I said, all right. What I was really thinking was, a lot of preachers in town, why didn't you call on somebody else? But he didn't. He called on me. And so I got him in my car, and I said, whereabouts? He said, take me down to the bank. And I said, well, he's got one of these Social Security checks, and he wants to get it cashed, and I have to do it for him. So we drove him downtown, took him in the bank, and I sat in the corner, kind of grumbling, that here I was being mistreated by taking up my time, and I was busy and going to have to preach that night. And while he was up at the counter talking to the teller, he turned around to me and said, preacher? I said, yes, sir. He says, you need any money? And I said, yes, sure do. Yeah, I need money. He says, how much would help you today? Oh, I said, a lot. I didn't know he had any money. He looked like a kind of a bum to look at him. And, he was an old man and lived there by himself. He didn't have anybody to keep him clean and all. And so I said, well, yeah. He said, would $4,000 help you? I came up off that seat. That was like $20,000 today. I said, help me. Yes, sir. And they handed through that little wire to him $4,000 in bills. And he turned around and, well, says, this will help you today. Let's go back home. Now, he did that several times. And you know, the day that we dedicated that new church, he died. And I preached his funeral. The day he had finished his job in helping me build my church was the end of his life. Well, now that's the way God helped us to build that church. So we were building faith upon faith, faith upon faith. And so when the Lord told us to go to the Philippines and said, I'll do more for you than I've ever done before, it was a challenge, but it was a reaching out of this inner faith again. I said, man, it's going to be exciting. If God supplied my needs in this country this way, think what he's going to do in that land. The denomination that I was a member of at that time, I don't belong to any at this time, before I got out there, they had started a little thing in Manila, and they had rented an old vegetable market that no longer operated as a vegetable market. It had iron bars on all four sides where the people could bring their vegetables in to sell them. And they took and interwove those wires with banana leaves. And even the front door was just an iron gate. That it was just an iron building like a jail. And it was 8 miles out of town. In fact, it was on the border of Caloocan and on the border of Manila. It was, on the border. Beside it was a drainage ditch that wasn't covered over at that time. And the first time I saw it, there were 2 dead hogs laying in the drainage ditch and 1 million blowflies. And very often the people that even came there had to put a white handkerchief over their face and nose, even to watch me preach, because the stench was so bad. And that would be a funny looking thing, you know, to have 15 or 20 people present and all of them with a bandana over their nose. You'd say, man, here comes the white bandits. But they weren't. They were people listening to the word of the Lord. I was so discouraged with that place until I didn't know what to do. 8 miles out of town. How could you ever move a nation 8 miles out of town? And so we began to pray and ask God to give us some land, and he did. He gave us a downtown lot, two blocks from the Congress buildings. Then I found a B-52 hangar that had never been up yet, really. It had just been passed around in different hands and sold to people. And I found it in a Pepsi-Cola garage, all in little pieces. And so we secured and bought it from the Pepsi-Cola people. We got these through a miracle. A young man, Paul Pipkin, went around to different churches and asked people to give a donation on the land, and never did get it all, I don't think. But I called back to this country, my friend Charles Blair in Denver. I called around to our mutual friends and asked them to give me money on the hangar. And so I had a piece of ground and a lot of steel laying down on it. and we started building. I secured a local architect and also a local builder, and here we started up with no congregation. And the city was leery. They had never had a great revival in the history of that country, and here a fellow was putting up a B-52 hangar to seat people in, and he had no congregation. I mean, there were times when I preached just to my wife and my boys, just us, no more. I couldn't get anybody else out. And so it went on for 6 months, and really, I was wondering if I had just missed God and should have stayed in America, because that thing wasn't working out. And then God did this phenomenal thing in the Philippines. A girl that was actually bitten by the devil. I know that in our society this is a difficult thing, but this didn't happen just once, you see. It went on for 3 weeks when there was nobody there but doctors and policemen. They were the only ones that observed this thing. The mayor of the city came and saw it, and a few celebrities, and some of the press saw it. And I was so busy with this empty piece of ground and this batch of steel that I'd bought, trying to get it up into the air and to fit that lot that we had bought down at Taft Avenue and United Nations Street, there on that magnificent corner, which was one of the busiest thoroughfares on the face of the whole earth. And I was occupied that I hadn't read a newspaper. I wasn't bothered with newspapers. I was building something, and this had gone on without my realizing it. And this spirit would put its teeth into this girl and bite her very severely. And she would faint, and she would be gone for 2 or 3 hours as she would faint. And so they didn't know what to do about it. They said, what in the world can we do? They sent for all kinds of help. They said, we want you to help us. And people tried to help, but they couldn't help. They had American doctors, Filipino doctors, Chinese doctors trying to help. And strange and terrible things would happen to this little girl. They're so bad until maybe one shouldn't tell them in public. You know, they're so bad. But some things that did happen that we could tell you was a medical doctor was examining her, and he couldn't find anything wrong because there was nothing wrong physically with her. And so he said, you're playing up to the press. Says, all you want is publicity. And so there's actually nothing wrong with you. She said, you will die. And 24 hours, he was dead. And the city said, hey, there is something bad going on out there. Not only this girl is being bitten in the soft parts of her body with teeth and fangs going in this deep and blood running underneath her skin and fainting away, one man dead. And then the chief jailer kicked her with his foot. And she said, you will die. 4 days later, they buried him. So 2 were dead now. And the mayor of the city went and saw her and was so frightened he ran. And certain times when doctors would try to work with her, she would beat them and claw them and bite them like an animal. And so here was a terrible situation. Now when that thing wasn't biting her, she was normal like a little 17-year-old girl. And so, but I knew nothing about it at all. Except in one night they put it on television. And when they put it on television, excuse me, on radio. When they put it on radio, and at the end of the 10 o'clock news, they said, if you got a weak heart, you better turn off your radio. I said that you might die. And that's what they said in the radio station. Well, I reached and turned my radio up. I didn't want to miss anything. And when I did, this little girl came on the air screaming. She was screaming as she came on the air. And I'd never heard anything so terrible in my life. They're killing me, they're killing me, they're killing me. And so I found myself standing in the middle of the floor. I was out of bed and standing up. They were so frightening. And the doctors quarreling with one another and so forth there. And so it was really a dreadful and a terrible situation. And I told my wife, I said, you go ahead and sleep, and I'll go in the front room. I went in the front room and lay down on the floor. And I began to cry and weep before the Lord that a little human was being destroyed in that city. And I was there, knew nothing about it, and it began to crowd on me. I said, there may be a lot of things taking place that I don't know anything about. There are people that are living today that have no idea what's going on in the world they live in. And that's a terrible thing, to be alive and not know what's going on in the world that you live in. And so I wept and cried all night. And as I showered the next morning, the Lord spoke to me and said, if you will go and pray for her, I'll heal her. I said, no. I stayed up all night. Get somebody else. And the Lord said again, if you would go and pray for her, I will heal her. I said, no, I don't want to go into billy-bid prison. I'm going to build a church. And you don't want a church related to a jailhouse. Yeah, I said, Lord, you know that. And the Lord knows a lot more than we do. You better believe it. And so as I went to get in my car and drive toward town, God said, if you'll go and pray for that girl, she'll be healed. And if you don't, she'll die. I said, Lord, get somebody else. The Lord spoke to my heart and said, I don't have anybody else. If you don't go, she'll die. I said, in a city of millions of people, and you don't have anybody else? He said, I have nobody that can go there and lay hands upon her and commission that evil spirit to leave her in the name of Jesus and to go. I have nobody that can do that if you don't go. And I said, Lord, if you don't have anybody, well, then I'll go. Yeah, I'll go. And so I didn't know where to go. So on the way to town, I went by my architect's house, a very wealthy person. He owned a large shoe factory right behind him that came to him through his father. Owned a magnificent home with a beautiful swimming pool in the backyard, and he was very well off. And besides being an architect, which I think he did just to occupy his time a little bit, but he was a very fine architect. And so I stopped in and I said, I want to go see this girl that's being bitten by the devil. He said, I'll go too. He was a Roman Catholic and not very religious. I said, well, do you know the mayor? And he said, yes. I said, well, let's go to the mayor's office. So he took us to the mayor's office, to a special elevator that went up on the inside of his office. And we got there, and the mayor was so busy. He was so busy until he couldn't, he was signing papers, you know, signing papers. He was just so busy. And so we couldn't get to him. And finally he said, Mayor, here's a man to go and pray for Clarita Villanueva. And when you mentioned that girl's name, his pen came out of his hand, and he looked up, and he said, and he saw this little American. He was a much larger man. And he said, 2 are dead because of her, and I wouldn't want you to be the 3rd one. And I said, no, I won't die. I said, Jesus told me to go pray for her and that he would heal her. Now, that's a lot of faith, you know, to be telling the mayor of a big city that. That's a lot of faith. And he said, yes, all right. And so we called the Billy Bid prison, his office did, and we went over there, and we found the head doctor, Dr. Lara. He was the head of the whole, he had 6 doctors in the prison. He was head doctor. And we found him in the morgue, and behind him was 2 cadavers. And he looked kind of bad. You know, he still had on his rubber apron. And if you've ever been in a place like that, it's not very nice. And so I said, I'm Lester Sumrall. I come from the mayor's office. Yeah, he said, they called over here. And I said, I want to see Clarita. And when I did, he got angry. You know, he had already asked for all the religion to help, and he asked the archbishop to come, and the archbishop said, well, says, I've got a bad cold. And he never did get over it, so he never did come. And then they made a plea, and all they got was a spiritist, and they said it was the spirit of John Baptist biting this girl. And so the doctors didn't agree with that. And so they weren't ready for any more religion. And so I said, well, I didn't come here just on my own. I was praying for this girl, and God told me that he'd heal her if I'd come and lay hands upon her. And then the mayor says I can come. So that softened him up. Then I opened my Bible to him, to the Mark's Gospel, chapter 16 and verse 16, that they that have faith shall cast out devils. And he accepted that, you know, he accepted that. Yeah, he says, well, if Jesus said it, it must be all right. He didn't know it was in the Bible, didn't know anything about it. By this time I was so weary, I said, well, I'll be back tomorrow. And so the next day, at 8 o'clock, I went home, laid on the floor, prayed all that night, didn't go to bed, prayed. So I'd had 2 nights and 1 day of prayer. And so I went back in the next morning, and there he had invited all kinds of people, all kinds of people. He had invited doctors, and he had invited nurses. He had invited police chiefs. He had invited personnel from the army that were braids across them. He'd invited professors from the University of the Far East. He had been real busy. Invited the world press. There were about 125 visitors. It was an awful thing to see. It was just, you know, I said, listen, doctor, all I want is a little place to pray for the girl. Then he got angry again. He said, this has all been done in the public. The whole world knows about it. We've had 3,000 cables from around the world telling us what to do, and none of them work. And said, if you do anything, everybody's going to see it. So I said, well, in that case, all right. All right. And so we said, take me to the girl. About a city block through Billy Bid Prison to the women's part. And so we went walking together. Behind us was this whole troop of people. I felt like a little mouse and 125 tomcats. And I knew I was going to get it. I knew the newspapers were going to say the wrong thing. I just knew it. As it's all over. I won't ever build a church in this city. It's finished right now. And so we went walking over. And as we were walking over, the doctor leaned over and said, a father. Of course, I have 3 sons. That's all right. I am a father. And I said, yes. He said, do you need some incense? Well, I hadn't thought of that. I hadn't never used any before. And I said, well, I might. I said, you stand by. And if I do, I'll tell you about it. So he says, all right, thank you. He was quite satisfied with that. We went in this hall where this little girl was. I went in this hall that was empty. And I went in first. All this 125 people came after me. And they filled up the hall. Then they brought in this little girl, 17 years old, a little thing. Her mother died when she was 12, and she had been a harlot ever since, making her own way in life. She couldn't imagine the number of men that she had slept with. She just had no idea of knowing. She was picked up on the streets of the city about 2 o'clock in the morning by the police because she was soliciting on the streets of Manila, and so they put her in jail. 48 hours after she got into jail, this terrible thing began to bite her. Now, the police couldn't see it. The doctors couldn't see it, but it would happen. Normally, it would happen when a male would touch her, either one of the officers in the prison or a doctor. When they would touch her, this thing would bite her. And so they began to study it and to find out that this spirit was angry when a male would touch her. That it wouldn't bite her if a female touched her. It had so many intricacies that it would take several hours to tell you all of the mess that they had on their hands in that jail. And with 2 of their people already dead. They brought this little girl in there, and she never said a word to all those people. But when she got to me, she says, I hate you. And when she said that, I went into action. Now, up until that moment, I had no idea what I would do. I grabbed her on both sides of her head. But that's what made the spirit bite, was when a male touched her. And so when I grabbed her to pray for her, she got bitten all over. I mean, she must have been bitten in 5 or 6 places simultaneously. She got bit on the back of the neck. She got bit on the back of the arm. She got bit on the leg. She got bit all over, just like that, and fainted. And Dr. Laura spoke out loud and said, well, it's all finished. Says she'll be this way for 3 or 4 hours. So we'll take her back to the hospital and try to bring her to again. But I was so worked up by this time until I wasn't ready for that. And after all, I had prayed for 2 nights and 1 day and had fasted. I hadn't had any food in 2 or 3 days. And so I held her little chin up and I popped her side of the head. And I said, you come around. And like that, she came back screaming and cursing. The doctors looked at one another and said, wow. Says, what took us 3 or 4 hours to do, this man can do in 30 seconds. We better just keep watching. But as I began to exercise the spirit, I turned to them and I said, you observers, get on your knees. Said, you know, business standing up. And then they were getting too close to me. And it was very hot and there was no air conditioning in that place. And I was about to suffocate from these people. And man, they all knelt down in a more reverential way, newspaper men and all, while I prayed for this girl. And as I began to pray for her, blasphemy came out of her mouth. It really wasn't a little girl's voice. Blasphemy against God the Father. Blasphemy against God the Son. Blasphemy against God the Holy Ghost. It was the most dreadful stuff you've ever heard in your life. It was the most filthy thing that I'd ever heard in my life. And as soon as it would come out of her, then the Spirit of the Lord would come upon me, and I would answer back as saying that it wasn't true. It was a dialogue. It was a battle of the worlds. It was a battle between demons and God. And we were the middle of it. I'd never seen anything like it. Well, I haven't seen anything like it since either. And so she blasphemed and she cursed and so forth. And even down she cursed me. When she was finished with that, I told that thing to come out of there. And instantly, the power of God came upon her, and she was delivered by God's mighty power. And it was a great victory. Everybody saw that she was completely delivered. The doctor got so excited, he put me in his car, took me to the courthouse, and ran into the mayor's office. Mayor, the devil is dead. And the mayor looked at me, and I said, no, he may be a good doctor, but he's not a good theologian. The devil is not dead. But I said, that girl is healed. That girl is healed. And that good mayor said, what can I do for you? And I hadn't thought of anything before. But I said, well, if you want to do something for me, I didn't expect anything. I've got plans for my new church building in this office that I can't get out because I don't have the money. And in about 10 minutes, I had those in my hand. He stamped them, he signed them, and he said, "You're the first Protestant that ever did get anything free here. I want you to know that." And he said, "What else can you have? Can I give you?" He said, "You can have anything you want in my city." Well, I said, "That's very kind of you." I said, "It looks to me like I need a place to tell the story of what God has done." He said, "Yeah, I think so." I said, "I'd like to have the place across the street in the plaza, in the beautiful plaza called the Sunken Gardens across the street." He says, "You can have it as long as you want it." So he signed it, and I left there with a permit. And soon after that, I brought Brother Clifton Erickson out there from the United States, and together we ministered to the people. We began with about 10,000, and then it jumped to 20, and then to 30, then to 40, to 50, and to 60,000 people a service. Every night at 6 o'clock after the news, I would go on a 50,000 watt station and tell the whole nation what was taking place in Manila. And they began to come out of the villages, out of the towns, out of the islands. They came in every way, small boats, big boats, carts, trucks, every way the humans could travel. They began to come into the city of Manila. And we saw the greatest revival I've ever seen in my life. All because of one miracle that God did in a few moments' time in Bilibid prison. You know, God can do more by His power in a moment of time. We have a book about this that you can order. We even have a film about it, and they still have the records of it in the city of Manila. And so it isn't a fantasy. It is a truth that God moved a nation by His mighty power. I didn't do it. As you can hear from the story, that I didn't do it, that God did it. He did it sovereignly. I didn't know what He was going to do when I went there. He did it Himself. And in this meeting, we saw the most remarkable and amazing miracles that I have ever seen in my total life. One night I preached, and I said, "I don't want any woman to move, just men. I want men that want to find God to come forward." We had over 5,000 men. You'd give a lot of money to see a thing like that. Not one woman moved, just men. And there were 5,000 men that came up to receive the Lord as their Savior. With their wives, that meant 10,000. With their children, 20,000. And so there was a whole city saved in one night. One night. It was one of the greatest things, and God did it through the healing of this girl. Through the healing of this girl. When Oral Roberts put the story in his magazine, he called it the miracle that changed a nation. And that revival persists. It don't even stop. You can go there today, and the revival is still going on in that country that they'd never had before. They'd never had it before, and they've had it ever since. I tell you, if we would do like Jesus said. Jesus said, if you wish to take a prey, to bind the strong man first, and then take a prey. And the strong man is the devil. And if we go to India or Africa or any other place, if we bind first the strong man, which is the devil, then you can get thousands, you can get millions saved. If you go and bind the strong man first. If you don't, all you do is keep running up against obstacles that the devil is putting there. You may not be able to see him. He's putting them there, and they have to be knocked down. During that revival, some of the greatest miracles, the number one movie actor of the whole country got healed. He'd had a stroke. His tongue even hung out the side of his mouth. And Carlos Padilla received a miracle. He could walk again. His tongue went back in his mouth. He could talk again by the mighty power of God. And those people almost went insane with joy when they saw this movie idol healed by God's mighty power. There was a lawyer in the courthouse downtown, and was very well known for the simple reason he walked on 2 crutches for 12 years. And so everybody knew him. He was the only one down there walking on 2 crutches for 12 years. He was a good lawyer. And one night he was healed. The 2 crutches fell off and were gone. And when he walked into the city hall the next day, people wouldn't believe it. They said, "You must be his brother, but you couldn't be him." And he said, "No, I'm him." He says, "I've been healed by the mighty power of God." And it touched everybody. When I took Oral Robertson to see the president of the country, he said, Christ is the answer. And that was the name of my church, and that was the name of our crusade, Christ is the answer. And so it really touched the people in a very great way. Now this is all a pattern of life. This is that life of faith we told you about. And now you say, how in the world did you pay for all this big building going up? We were offered $1 million American money for it just recently. So it wasn't a small thing. And yet when we dedicated it, it was all paid for. But God did many ways to supply those funds. Just many, many ways to supply those funds. For example, we made friends there with a Chinese family, the Gopun Singh family. They owned a newspaper. They had a daughter that had lost her mind, and completely, she was crazy. And we went out and prayed for her and laid our hands on her. God healed her instantly. Well, when we started this great crusade, and the newspapers wanted to say something against it, the Goes, who were newspaper men, they went right over and saw them to say, don't write those lies. This is a good man. He healed a member of my family. And so we had good newspaper relations because of him. A doctor's group pulled us up in front of the courts because we were healing people without a permit. And so I don't know how the noise got all over town. By the time I got to the courthouse, we had 2 judges and 2 or 3 lawyers that were there to defend us, to defend me. And then they asked the lawyers that were working for the Doctors Association. I said, have you been there? And they said, no. And they pointed their finger at him and said, that's just like men like you. That's just like men like you. You'd come and prosecute an innocent man, and you don't know what you're talking. You've not even been there. And the judge that had the case was almost afraid, because the judge that was on our side was a judge higher than he was. And so he told him, he says, we go to this man's meetings every night, and says, people are getting blessed and healed. So this is the best thing that ever came to the Philippines. The judge says, case dismissed. And so we saw the power of God function in such amazing ways. And you get a crowd of 40 and 50 and 60,000 people, and we would pass the offering for a free will offering to those people. And they're the ones that built that church. We would get a trunk full of money every night from those people. A trunk full. And we would give that on the building every day. And so that's the way that the building was finished. I would say 25% of the money came from my friends in America, and 75% of it came from those beautiful people there in the Philippines. And Mrs. Go, she knew the Chinese community was rich, and she was a leader in the community, so she'd have her chauffeur to come pick me up, and we'd go to some of these rich Chinese homes, and all of them had sickness in them, and she would have me to pray for those sick people, and then she'd say, give him an offering. Whew, I'd come back home in the day with enough money to run a project for a week, after they'd all made a donation to the building. And so it went up by a miracle, and it was so beautiful. The architect, was a slow mover. Yeah, if you told him to get up at 7, he was up at 8. If you told him to meet you at 8, he got there at 9. He was a slow mover, a wealthy man. He didn't have to move fast. And one day I told him, I said, you know something, Cornelio, I said, when we dedicate this church, you'll get there late. You won't get to say anything, being the architect. And I said, the crowd will be so big, you'll have to stand in the street. That was a prophecy. And that was 6 months before it happened. And it happened exactly that way. When the meeting was all over and all finished and the people were gone, here he came in the door. He was a very elegant person and always had a bodyguard with him, because he was a very wealthy man. He always was dashing himself with his handkerchief, drying off the perspiration. He came rushing in, and he was a very handsome person. And he said, I'm late. Well, I said, I told you 6 months ago you would be late. And I said, I told you you'd have to stand out in the street, because there'd be no place inside. He said, that's exactly what happened to me. And he said, this is the biggest crowd I've ever seen in my life. And he was the one I'd had a quarrel with, because he asked me where the congregation was, and I told him I didn't have them yet. And he wanted to quit the drawing of the prints because I didn't have a congregation. And I had to abruptly tell him that I wasn't paying him to gather the congregation. I was only paying him to draw up the blueprints. And I said, if you don't hurry up, I'll have to change architects. And so he went ahead and did it. And now we became very close friends because of the blessing and the power of God. So when we had the great revival, then we had to baptize these people. It took us a whole week, every night from 7 to 12, baptizing those people. It was super. It was great. And then it took us a whole month to take in the membership. We take in all we could, physically, I mean, and then we say next Sunday we'll start over again. All of them had to take a course, all of them had to sign papers, and I tell you, we had a job ever getting them in. And the blessing began to flow. We had more respect in that city than we've ever had in any place on the face of the earth. They began to love a person that was a foreigner, and they accepted him maybe higher than that of a minister. In fact, the Lord spoke to me and said, I can't let you stay here. He says, you've done the job I sent you to do. He says, you can't stay here. And I said, why? Why, Lord? He said, because they would serve you and love you and not me. And I cannot share my praise and my honor with a human. He says, I can't do that. And so I actually left the Philippines because God told me to. And a lot of people couldn't understand it. I was there 2.5 years, and they said, man, yes, it would have been a great experience. I'd had 50 churches built by now, no doubt. They'd have been built all over that place. God only knows what would have happened. But when God tells you that you're the pioneer of a thing, then you have to just do what God tells you to do. After that, we went to Hong Kong and built 2 churches, and that was a great experience, a tremendous experience. The Chinese are so different from the island people, just completely different. And we moved in there, and God gave us a sovereign work of His will and His power. We saw a tremendous thing done for God that was so wonderful until you couldn't hardly describe. The churches are still there. You can go with us sometime. We make trips out there every year, and you can see it for yourself and rejoice in what God is doing. Then we went back into the Philippines again because the church got into some difficulties, and then we spent another 1.5 years ministering in that church. And at the end of that time, though we had no intention of moving quickly, at the end of that time, I was invited by President Marcos to a very special event, and I went. And coming out of there was a mob in the street, and most of it was against America. And this is what caused the martial law to take place. Otherwise, it had communism in the country. But they had nasty signs up, "Go home, white monkeys." America is imperialist, and jangling them up and down and screaming and yelling. And I went down among those people, and I said, "Go home, white monkey." Is that me? He said, "Sir, I don't know." I said, "No, you're sure not a monkey." And I said, "You better throw that down." And he threw it down, and I stomped it. I said, "What are you doing carrying it?" He said, "I was given a peso to carry this." And I went over to the boy that had a sign that says, "America's imperialist." And I said, "You know history very well, don't you?" He said, "No, I don't." I said, "You're carrying a sign there that says America's imperialist." He said, "Yeah, but I'm just given a peso to carry the sign. I don't agree with what's on it." I said, "You better throw it down." And he stomped that. And I put my hand on his shoulder, and I said, "My country gave your country freedom twice. With the blood of our young men, we gave you freedom." He says, "I believe it." And by this time, I was all stirred up inside and weeping. My church was 2 blocks away. I went up and put my head on my desk, and I was weeping. And God spoke to me and says, "I want you to go back to America to stay." Now, that hadn't happened in a long, long time, to stay. Here I'd already ministered down 100 nations of the world. And he didn't mean I couldn't go visit other countries. But he said, I said, "Why?" He said, "America's in worse shape than this country." And he began to tell me what would happen in America, including the universities going up in a blast with the students running riot and burning the buildings. He told, and before it ever happened, he told me it would happen. And then he told me there would be this terrible sex thing, that you never heard of homosexualism in the newsprint. God told me that this thing was going to happen. He told me that the great scourge of spiritism that was going to come to this country, when Oriental religions would be believed by people in our own block, in our own community. I said, no, I've been through these heathen lands. They don't have anything for our people. God says they will accept it, and they will be hurt by it. And they'll go to hell because of it, because it's backed up by the devil. And it's all come to pass exactly as the Lord showed me. There's only one thing that He showed me that hasn't come to pass, and that is that bestiality, where men and women would commit fornication with animals. And that He told me that would come to pass and become popular, and people would boast about it. That in order for the dog to have tranquility, that they would have to have fornication with the dog. Our morals in our country, God said America needed help. And I said, "God, how can I help America?" And God says, "You will never help America unless you get on television." He said, you won't even see America if you don't go on television. Well, I didn't know much about television. I had a few shows, on television, but I had no knowledge of them. I says, I'll build a program for television. God said, no, I'm not talking about that. He says, you will have to own the stations. Other Christians will have to own the stations. And says a network of these stations will be the channel of truth to America one day. And says you must do it. And says otherwise you won't even see the American people. Did you know at that time I was living in Manila, very few Americans even knew I was alive. And at this moment I minister personally each day to between 4 and 6 million Americans every day. Yeah, through all the television stations. I'm in Los Angeles twice a day. I'm in Miami, Florida twice a day. Phoenix, Arizona twice a day. Oklahoma City twice a day. Denver twice a day. Indianapolis, Indiana 4 times a day. South Bend, Indiana a number of times a day. We're on a cable system all throughout this land. We are on 2 satellite systems. We can't get to the end of telling you the openings of this. Almost every day a new channel of ministry opens to us that we might. Now that's not normal nor natural, but it is supernatural. God did it, and He told me before I left the Philippines. So I told my beautiful church goodbye. Now, this is the second time I told them goodbye, and I said I'm leaving. I'm going home. And I said, I'll come back and see you. And I do. I go every year to see them. But we pulled out and left and came back. When I came back to America, the first minister I met, who was a friend of mine, looked me in the eye and said, Sumrall, you are 50 and you are finished. And he said it as if he was glad I was finished. And I looked up at him and I said, I don't believe that. I said, I believe that's a lie. He said, that's the truth of it. You're 50. He said, you don't have a thing. He says, you don't have anything in this country. You don't have anything overseas. You've given it all away. He just shook his head at me. He says, I don't understand you. He says, you're 50 and you're finished. And I went to prayer and I said, Lord, I know I'm 50. Am I finished? The Lord said, you just gotten started. Says your life and ministry is in front of you. Not this missionary work behind you, but in front of you. I said, Lord, I am ready for it. And I came back to this country with my wife and children, and we had only a house. That's all we had. We had no office place. We had nothing. And we began. And God began to do miracles. God began to do miracles. On our own property, we gave it to the church. We decided to give it away, the house that we had bought a number of years before, and began to build some office buildings and a church building on that spot there. We asked the bank that we were doing business with if they'd help us, and they said no. And so we just started right off to building the thing without any money. We wrote all my friends in America that I had, all my mailing lists, and said, please help us. We're going to build our offices here for a world ministry and going to build a chapel by it where you can come and listen to me preach here, and we'd be glad for you to help us. They sent out a little money, we got going. But the American National Bank in South Bend, Indiana, that I'd never had any business with, I had never put any money in the bank, nor borrowed any. I had no relationship with them at all. Sent their executive, their first vice president out, and I was at the end of myself. We had some steel walls up, we had no roof, and we had no rooms. It was just a skeleton. And he came and says, I'm looking for Sumrall. And I says, I'm Lester Sumrall. He didn't even know me. He said, I'm the American National Bank. Says, do you have a loan on this building yet? And I said, no, sir. Well, who would loan me money, when I just gotten back from overseas. I didn't have any, I didn't have any relations. And so I said, no, I don't. He says, would you like to have a loan? I said, yes, sir, I need a loan. He said, we'll make a loan to you if you'll come down and receive it. I said, would you loan me enough? He said, we'll loan you what you need. He said, you know how much you need? I said, yes. I said, to put the roof on this thing, and I get it where I can move inside. It won't be finished, but to move inside and start using it, I need $140,000, and that would be like $500,000 right now. And he said, we'll loan you that. I went down and signed the papers, and we finished our building, and the Lord spoke to me and said, because you signed the contract to build the building with a very large builder, I provided for you. I provided for you. Says, now, everything that you will sign for, I will provide it for you. I said, right, Lord. All right. And so that building was finished, and right in the middle of it, the Lord gave me a radio station. And right in the middle of that, we built a building for our Bible school. And then came after that the television stations. In our next part, which would be part 5, we will tell you that whole amazing and remarkable story of how God built the television network and the Bible college that goes on right now. And that from that Bible college, my teachings are going out throughout the world, and we're starting little schools. We have them in Honolulu. We have them in Hong Kong. We have them in Manila. We have them all over this country. It's a phenomenon what God is doing. And God is doing it. To Him be the honor and the praise and the glory for it. May I bless you, please. Father, bless our friend right now. And let them know that God is real and God is great and that faith is real. And to believe God and to trust God in Jesus' name. If you would like a copy of this, I'd be glad to, if you to get it, you can get it audio, and they'll tell you in just a moment how much it will cost you to get it. And you can get it on video for your half-inch players in your home, and you can listen to it again and again, to the miracle power of God today. You know, not 2,000 years ago, but today, the miracle power of God. We do want you to see it again and to hear it again and to be blessed by it. And to let your faith be built up by it. To put your trust in God. The same God who gave me John 15 and 16 is the same God today that'll say unto you that He'll bless you and help you. Won't you trust Him? Won't you believe Him for it? Won't you accept it? We want you to. And I hope that you'll be able to see our coming up part of this glorious story of faith and of God's ability to do wonderful things in the now. He's not the God of yesterday. He's the God of right now, and wants to bless you, to save you, to heal you, to assist you in your business. He's a mighty, miracle-working God. Thank you for being with us during this time. We certainly do appreciate it. May the good Lord wonderfully bless you. And until we're back with you just a little later, we say, why don't you, by all means, just feed your faith. And in feeding your faith, why don't you starve your doubts to death? Every time you do feed your faith, you starve your doubts to death. So why don't you let them die and let your faith live forever? Bless you.